Gibraltar sets free the Iranian supertanker UK authorities seized back in July. Authorities in Hong Kong have announced that violent protesters injured 180 police officers so far. And women's rights organizations hold a forum in Nicaragua to discuss the achievements of gender equality measures. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. The Iranian supertanker, formerly known as Grace 1, is expected to depart Gibraltar at any point after local authorities rejected the United States' latest request to not release it. The tanker was seized by the UK Marines back on July 4th on suspicion of violating EU sanctions by delivering oil to Syria. Earlier on Sunday, the ship was reflagged to Iran's flag and changed its name to Adrian Darya before heading to the Mediterranean. On Thursday, Gibraltar's government announced it would release Iran's Grace 1 supertanker, which had been seized by British Marines 6 weeks back. Then on Friday, the U.S. issues a warrant for the seizure of the tanker. A bit earlier, I was able to speak with Ahmed Caballo, who is just back from Gibraltar, reporting for Press TV. Ahmed was outside of the Supreme Court as the decision was made to release the tanker.
I arrived for the court at 10:30 a.m. local time, and the U.S. Department of Justice put in a request at 1:36 a.m. The Attorney General then delayed the proceedings and said we would reconvene at 4 p.m. And everyone outside the court just assumed that the US would get its way, particularly because of the precarious position the UK is in with leaving the European Union and the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. However, at 4:30 p.m. local time, Gibraltar time, to our surprise, the tanker was ordered to be released, and it was very embarrassing for US officials who were talking about the tanker as if the court had already made its decision in their favor. Now, on Friday, the day after the decision, the US has put in this request, an arrest warrant, based on three things. It claims that it was violating the Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is obviously the unilateral sanctions that the United States placed on Iran following their retreat from the JCPOA agreement. Bank fraud, because they believe that the sales of the oil tanker would be in American markets and American financial systems. Money laundering. And then the third thing was terrorism, because the US obviously designates the Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. Now, everybody that's looked at these charges feel like they're kind of fake charges as a way for the US to save face, because it was very publicly embarrassed by the decision made by the chief minister and the Gibraltar officials on Thursday afternoon.
Take us back to why British Marines originally seized the supertanker. What legal basis does the UK and US have in governing what Iran does with shipments like these?
It's a very interesting question, because there was the legal justification was very shaky to begin with. So it argued that the tanker was breaking EU sanctions because it was delivering oil to Syria. Now, Iran is not part of the EU, so therefore doesn't have to apply. Is not eligible or bound by EU sanctions. And none of the other countries that are part of the EU, full-fledged members of the EU, Spain, Germany, France, supported this decision. In fact, the Spanish said that this was not about EU sanctions. This was at the request of the United States, which is obviously not part of the European Union, and that it was a politically motivated move, not underpinned by international or EU law, particularly as the UK is in a process of exiting the European Union. So as Mr. Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, said when he heard about the seizure of this boat, is that the British are trying to be more Catholic than the Pope, more European than the Europeans.
And Tehran has called the seizure maritime piracy. You recently released a Press TV documentary on Venezuela, which you spent time in Venezuela. Do you think the U.S. is employing parallel or similar policies on Iran and Venezuela?
100%. I mean, the justification for what they do in Venezuela is what the colonial racist policy of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, that policy is based on the fact that because Venezuela is in quote unquote their backyard, they can interfere in their sovereign affairs. Iran is not in their backyard. It has nothing to do with what America calls its backyard. Yet they feel like they have the unilateral super jurisdiction to somehow interfere with oil sale between one sovereign nation to another sovereign nation. It's very important to also compare it to Venezuela, because the US, while it tried to attempt a coup in Venezuela that failed, it's also failed with this policy. The US officials, like I said, were talking as if the UK would grant their wishes as if it was a genie in the bottle, but that did not happen. And the US has very much been embarrassed on the international stage. So just like the coup failed in Venezuela, their attempts to seal the oil tanker as of yet have failed.
We're talking about 2.1 million barrels of oil. Did you get a sense of what kind of effects these sorts of sanctions have on the people in those two countries?
Yeah, I mean, the sanctions have a terrible effect. And it doesn't just have an effect on the Iranian people, doesn't just have an effect on the Venezuelan people, but it also has an effect on the US citizens themselves. I was reading a story just yesterday about an American citizen that wanted to go to Cuba to have treatment for his lung cancer, but was barred, and he had to go there illegally to get treatment. So US citizens themselves are suffering under sanctions. And the thing that annoys me the most is the US administration tries to pretend that it's on the side of the Iranian people and on the side of the Venezuelan government. Now, whatever you think of the Venezuelan government or of the Iranian government, the sanctions don't affect them. It affects the people on the ground, working class, the people that are struggling to get in medicines to their hospitals.
About 180 police officers have been injured after being attacked by violent protesters, according to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government. They say that police officers' family members are also under different degrees of intimidation and bullying. A notice from Hong Kong authorities said that, unfortunately, radical and violent protesters repeatedly carried out illegal acts during the last 2 months, and that the government fully supports the police in efforts to enforce the law and restore peace. Footage has circulated showing protesters destroying public property, throwing bricks, and targeting police stations. On Saturday, demonstrations were held at a park in Hong Kong with calls for an end to violence and riots. Nearly 500,000 rallied in condemnation of the targeting of police and the support by US-based NGO and local groups which are US-financed. And those protests reached Sydney, Australia, with demonstrators saying that much of the confrontations which have taken place on the ground in Hong Kong were the result of the violent approach of the so-called pro-democracy rioters. They say that many Chinese students have actually voiced their opposition to the demonstrations.
There have been a lot of violence and violent protests in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong people have suffered from that, and we want to voice our call for the peace and order in Hong Kong. That's the purpose of this of today's rally.
Dueling demonstrations were held in the Canadian city of Vancouver, a city with a large Chinese population. One group supported the Western-backed Hong Kong protests and were seen holding Canadian flags, while many others carried the Chinese flag and demanded the end to riots backed by US interests and funding.
The mob mentality is definitely there. We don't want separation. We love Hong Kong. We love China. We want them to stay together, and we don't want any sort of violence. If they want to talk, we can all sit down and have a conversation like adults do. But we shouldn't be going.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. Now to Nicaragua for a look at the impact which gender equality measures have had in the Sandinista-governed country.
It's a well-known fact that the countries that make up the Northern Triangle of Central America Honduras, El Salvador and Guatemala have some of the highest homicide rates in the world and are suffering from a migration phenomenon as people flee in search of a better life. In the face of these issues, political activists in Nicaragua held a forum focusing on women's issues and on preserving peace in the region. Dorothea Granada was born in the US but has been living in Nicaragua since the 1980s and is a director of an organisation that promotes women's rights, from health to safety and empowerment.
In every Latin American country, women come second. We are second-class citizens. In Nicaragua, since the Sandinista revolution was victorious, every year we have more laws in support of women.
Women's empowerment can be seen and felt, says Carmen, whose life changed 7 years ago. She used to be a homemaker, but now she owns her own food business. She's part of 133,000 women who are part of cooperatives promoted by the Sandinista government that helped them start their own businesses.
They give us plenty of help, starting from loans. There's no stealing here. This is great help for us women to get ahead. But we need to set our own goals and put in work, because if we're not determined to get ahead, then we won't.
At this gathering, the main topics discussed are the restitution of women's rights and globally recognised government programmes that have pushed it to be one of the countries with the highest rate of gender equality.
I think the role of a woman in Nicaragua can be seen from various angles. I prefer to look at it from a quality standpoint, because often women are part of a political system, but they don't have power to effect change. They cannot make decisions, and that's what's important. That empowers women and helps them move ahead. This is the sort of progress that has been made in Nicaragua. Women have been truly empowered.
According to the UN, 80% of the victims of people trafficking in Central America are women. As such, the Sandinista government has announced that they are working on legislation to punish crimes against the dignity of women.
Peru's Ni Una Menos women's rights movement demonstrated in Lima on Saturday to condemn gender-based violence. Protesters were escorted by a heavy police presence as the group stopped outside of the nation's Supreme Court. The demonstration was sparked by figures published by the Women's Ministry showing that 103 women were killed in acts of gender-based violence so far this year.
We women march every year. We go out constantly to demand justice, to demand an end to violence against us. We do it for us, for the survivors, and also the victims who were killed, and in memory of them. We are now on the streets. Even so, the state does not listen to us. The state is being complacent. The justice also does not listen to us, nor do they give us justice.
The Assembly of Caribbean Peoples continues in Trinidad and Tobago with delegates from movements in 15 countries. Participants have discussed the fight against the imperialist agenda and the need to strengthen social resistance and the integration of the region. The meeting agenda also includes debates on climate change and social change and the issues of racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. The gathering will culminate on Monday with a final declaration, which will include the commitments derived from the Assembly's constructive dialogue.
Trump! No more 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 Trump! Thank you. Trump! No more Trump! No more Trump! No more Trump! No.
That No More Trump slogan began in Venezuela, where signatures have been collected for the past week. In response to U.S. intervention from the Venezuelan people. Now on to other stories. Bolivia's President Evo Morales joined candidates of the movement towards socialism known as the MAS on a metropolitan cycling caravan. They toured 4 municipalities of Cochabamba as part of his campaign ahead of the October 20th election. President Morales was accompanied by the governor of the department, the president of the parliamentary brigade, and of the region, and of the mayor, Humberto Sanchez. Applause and support chants could be heard as residents lined areas of the route. On Saturday, Bolivia's Mass Party held a massive rally in La Paz, attesting to the popularity and support for the presidential election bid of Evo Morales and Alvaro Garcia Linera. Their campaign centers around the promise to continue to eliminate poverty and consolidate industrialization of the country. Morales has warned about the damage caused by neoliberal policies in Bolivia and beyond. Argentina's economy minister has resigned in a cabinet reshuffle following President Mauricio Macri's defeat in last weekend's primary elections. He was one of the architects of Argentina's $57 billion bailout deal with the IMF signed last year. His replacement comes as the fund said it may suspend a visit to Argentina next week following President Mauricio Macri's latest economic measures. A series of tax breaks and bonuses were intended to woo back voters, but social movements have rejected them as too little too late.
After the run on the peso following the elections, some producers stopped selling because of the uncertainty. By Friday, the currency stabilized at 17.6% below its value the week before, and retailers put up their prices accordingly.
Milk, cheese, flour and oil. I did the shopping yesterday and it was really tough. I get the minimum pension and it's very difficult.
The peso has fallen and that means everything has gone up. For example, soft drinks and biscuits. Everything.
Medicines were also affected.
Since yesterday, we have been increasing the prices between 10 to 15%. And yes, people are feeling it. They ask and look for a cheaper alternative, but that's the way it is.
Tamiro sells farm produce.
Our costs have gone up 20%, but we haven't passed it on to the consumers yet, because we are selling very little, and if we put the price up, we'll sell nothing.
It's a chain, and this is our livelihood. If sales go down here, then my standard of living goes down, so, well, one thing feeds into another.
The government eliminated VAT on basic goods, which was at 10.5%. But consumers say this measure is not reflected in the prices they have to pay.
From what I remember of the history of this country, every time a measure is taken that's meant to benefit the people, the consumers and the businesses absorb the benefits and the prices never go down. When the peso has gone up, I never saw the prices go down to reflect that. And now the peso is falling, and I think the companies are just taking advantage of this.
In the shops, people say the government's measures to benefit Argentinian consumers have so far had no effect. But the price rises are already a reality.
We'll take a short break now. Welcome back. Residents of Srinagar in Indian-occupied Kashmir took to the streets on Sunday, demanding freedom after New Delhi reimposed movement restrictions. Many of the protesters marched with their faces covered while chanting, "We want freedom." Indian authorities have said that they lifted the movement restriction. However, major parts of the city are still blocked by police. Security forces have also erected steep barricades and used wires to block roads. A security lockdown has entered its 14th straight day after India stripped occupied Jammu and Kashmir of its semi-autonomous status.
No one in the world can stop us from having our freedom. That is our basic right, freedom.
The day is of 24 hours, out of which they eased the movement restriction for half an hour. I'm worried about everything, my children and my family.
Members of the Southern African Development Community have called on the United States and the European Union to immediately lift economic sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. Tanzanian President and Chairman of the bloc, John Magufuli, says that the policy is hurting the region. Meanwhile, the Zimbabwean president has blamed the sanctions for crippling development in the country. The sanctions were imposed in 2002 when Robert Mugabe was president. Other issues discussed were the political and security situation in the region, as members also resolved to adopt Kiswahili as the fourth official language of the bloc.
Among the resolutions we reached is we shall continue pursuing international organisations to lift sanctions against Zimbabwe. We'll do this through our ambassadors and other regional blocs. And just to make it clear, all the presidents from SADC member countries, we have agreed in one voice to be supportive of Zimbabwe in this and to never leave them alone.
Sudan's military council and protest leaders have signed a constitutional declaration that paves the way for a transition to a civilian government. The agreement ushers in a new governing council, including both civilians and generals, to pave the way towards elections. It also formalizes the creation of a transitional administration that will be guided by an 11-member sovereign council comprised of 6 civilians and 5 military personnel. The two sides have agreed to rotate the chairmanship of the council for the next 39 months. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia and the Prime Minister of Egypt and the South Sudanese president were among regional leaders attending Saturday's signing ceremony.
I assure you that our armed forces will do their best in order to protect the will of the people and the safety of the transition to a democratic civil rule.
Let the arrest warrant and accusation issued by the International Court of Justice against the ousted President Omar al-Bashir be witness to the fact that the old regime left no crime uncommitted. All of these crimes against our people makes the legitimate questioning and evaluation aimed at bringing justice to the victims and the families one of the most important roles of the government.
Burials have begun in Afghanistan after a bomb exploded at a wedding hall, killing at least...
Mosques, markets and public places indicates the atrocity of a terrorist group who is determined to kill innocents. The Taliban cannot absolve themselves of blame, for they provide a platform for terrorists.
Migrants on board the open arms humanitarian rescue ship stranded off the coast of Italy have attempted to swim ashore. The boat is carrying 107 migrants who were rescued 2 weeks ago and has been anchored near the island of Lampedusa, hoping to get permission to dock. Italy's far-right Interior Minister Matteo Salvini has so far refused to grant the ship a pass, but on Saturday he let 27 miners disembark under orders of the Prime Minister. The Spanish government on Sunday offered Algeciras as a port to disembark the migrants. However, the Open Arms has said that they're unable to dock in Spain due to an emergency situation on board.
We do not accept Spain as a port. We cannot risk the safety of all these people. They need to disembark now. We are in a state of humanitarian emergency. We cannot put the physical integrity of the people rescued and the crew through 6 more days of sailing.
We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at tellusenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Our English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.